we'll start with a few questions here, from the table to our distinguished speaker, and then we'll have to engage you in a conversation as well. And, if I may, I want to just start out with just making a statement that piggybacks on something, Jake, that you said. It's often been my observation that one of the reasons why so little happens on the national policy front is that the potential losers from any major climate change mitigation policy, the number of those is relatively small, and they are particularly articulated and well organized. While the number of potential winners is relatively large, they are less organized, they don't speak with a voice. And so a large number of rather voiceless individuals are faced by a small number of very articulate, outspoken, and well-funded individuals. And in that crossfire, it's very hard to make policy decisions that benefit the majority.
Like all of politics. Yeah. I think that's correct. But this is true across a lot of different issues. But it's very important in this one, I think. And but it's made worse in that you've got this heavily ideological overlay, where there's a lot of money on one part of the ideological side, and we've not had until the last 10 days a strong voice on the other side of this, on the ideology. That is that we ought to do this because it's the right thing to do. Because a lot of the arguments are we ought not to do this because it's the wrong thing to do, and then they attack the science as a way of making that argument because they don't want to argue that it's against their economic interest.
One of our speakers in one of the last open classrooms, Bill Moore, made the case that maybe we shouldn't, and this was a case made on the international front, maybe we shouldn't phrase this as a climate change issue. We should probably phrase this as a right to development and right to lifestyles and right to a standard of living issues, and discuss this in that context.
Yeah, there's been a lot of effort by different groups to find a way to turn this issue around so that it's not so negative. That is, so we're not always saying we got to stop doing this, we have to take the pain and such. That's not really good sales technique. And you may sense in my talk a bit of a struggle to try to be positive when I'm not very optimistic about it. And I think one of the ways that people have done this is, and this is true from at the international level through the work by the United Nations Environment Program and the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, is to frame this in terms of green growth. So you want the green economy, green growth, sustainability. So try to reframe the issue in terms of positive things rather than negative things. And I'm for anything that works. But one of the things you have to think about when you do that is what you get. When you do green growth, does that really attack the problem that you wanted? Does it really get at the emissions that you want to get at? It may be a good thing for a lot of reasons, but it's not necessarily focused necessarily on the emissions question. But that's a very strong push at the international level, is to convert this into agreements on green growth. And I mentioned the huge activity under the UN, under the Framework Convention on a climate agreement. There is another diplomatic process going on. I don't know exactly where it is now, but there's another diplomatic process. The same diplomats go to these meetings trying to form agreements on green growth. Now, what would that be? It would be things about agreements on technologies you adopt in particular sectors and things like that. So that's going on. People are trying. I mean, that's why I say this. That's why we really have a kind of a regime complex. And I didn't mention the whole green growth world. That's another part of this. Still another one that I didn't. There's just limited time. Secretary Clinton has adopted a scheme which was put forth by the UN Environmental Program to focus on short-term greenhouse substances, to focus on methane and black carbon. It's another potential agreement. So people are running around looking for something that makes some net contribution.
In one of your earlier slides, you showed the developing world and then the G20, the BRIC countries, and so forth. And I think the bottom line, looking at that slide, is that if we don't do something about coal in India and China, it really doesn't matter what the EU and the United States do in terms of reducing their emissions, because that's where the big growth in emissions is. So could you comment a little bit, and perhaps the hope in that regard is the green growth argument, in that if somehow we help them leapfrog past the fossil fuel economy, that there is some hope there, although I ultimately think it ends up being carbon tax being the only answer.
I guess I would say two things. I try to avoid the word no hope. and this is the reason I made the argument earlier that almost anything that we can do, although it doesn't deal with China, it maybe does, or it does a little bit with China, almost anything that we can do has its biggest effect on the upper tail and kind of the worst outcome. So I make that argument in order to try to avoid despair, the no hope argument. So I just reveal my tactic here. I think one of the hopes for China is building, huge amounts of coal-fired power. One of the things that our work indicates as kind of a hope is that the Chinese need to deal with the pollution problem is going to influence the coal years. So if you read the newspaper recently, you read that what happened in Beijing. I mean, it blew over the top off of all the measuring instruments. It was so bad. It was so bad in Beijing, and they have in the 12th five-year plan a target of air pollution reduction, and our analysis shows they can't meet it. They can't do it with the coal plan that they have. Now, what are they going to do? I mean, they can try to clean up coal, but even with their attempts to clean up coal, cleaner coal meaning stopping the particular emissions, the sulfur and such, they can't achieve that. So just dealing with their own health problem is going to have some effect on us. And they are trying to do things, and they are, as you know, in the lead on solar and wind and all that. But those numbers are really small. If they're going to make a difference in the coal side, it's going to be on the demand side, which is going to be tough. But it would be on nuclear. So I think getting China, to just substantial reductions below their current level or something like that's going to be very, very hard. But I think there is some possibility of getting down below the projections that are on that figure.
Let me follow up with something else that might sound like a rhetorical statement or question. If indeed the Indias, the Brazils, the Chinas of the world have to technologically leapfrog, how come here in the US, where we pride ourselves in innovation, in financial prowess, in creativity, why don't we take this as a business opportunity and leapfrog here so that we are ready with the technologies that ultimately all of us will need to use?
Well, I think in terms of the development of the technologies, we're doing that. And a lot of money has gone into technology, both venture capital money and particularly in the money that went into the recovery money. Lots of money went into these things. But one of the problems is that we develop these technologies, take solar, for example, but we are not necessarily competitive in the making of the panels. So I'm going to say something somewhat controversial here, but for purposes of discussion. I'm involved in a study we're doing at MIT on the future of solar, and the conclusion that I've come to about the solar panels, we focus on these panels that the Chinese are making because there's a big glut in supply now. And the view that I've come to is that the solar panels, not the installation, not all the other equipment, not all the other problems you have in getting solar to be accepted, the panels themselves, they're like tennis shoes. Where do we make tennis shoes? We make tennis shoes where you have cheap labor to make tennis shoes. And so that's where the solar is going to go. Even China won't necessarily be able to keep that industry long term. So we're not necessarily competitive in that business. We're very competitive in doing the R&D, And we may want to make all kinds of efforts to get our industries to use that technology, and maybe we can get efficient enough in some of this work to make the panels. But the notion that we can capture that industry, and you see that to some degree in the president's statements about this, I think that overlooks the fundamental economics of that particular technology. It's closer to tennis shoes than to high tech now, at the manufacturing level.
Let's open this up to questions and comments from all of you. And if you wouldn't mind, raise your hand or move up with the microphone to make sure that we can hear you. And this will obviously all be recorded. Do me a favor too, if you wouldn't mind, and state your name so we know who you are. We'll start our way back from the top now that the microphone's up there.
Hi, my name is Will Walker. I'm a PhD student here at Northeastern. I'm actually in this class. You had a graph up earlier showing the cost to the U.S. economy to reduce our emissions by 50%, by 80%. You said that there's $1 trillion off the economy to do 50% reduction. How much of that trillion is deadweight loss, and how much of that is simply diverting funds from one firm to another? Because of course, one firm's expense on compliance becomes another firm's revenue.
Yeah, the answer is all of it. That's the true economic cost. The transfers are not shown there. So for the economists in the argument, that's an equivalent variation calculation. So it is in effect the sum of the deadweight loss. So it is the true impact on the economy, and it doesn't contain the things that you have in mind, that there are transfers back and forth, there are winners and losers and such, but that are not the net impact of the economy. So that is the true economic cost. Now it looks like a big number, but we were adding up. We were discounting over 35 years, so it's not necessarily such a big number in terms of the total economy.
And probably to put it in perspective too, one doesn't only need the cost of acting on climate change, but also the cost of inaction, right? That's the one against which one we need to compare this.
Just one more, is that we also have the co-benefits in there. So a lot of those, another part of this problem that I didn't really emphasize is that if you clean up the coal, there are a lot of co-benefits, like health, because you're also cutting the particulate emissions and you're cutting ozone and other properties. So there are also co-benefits that can be substantial.
Sir.
My name is Rick Matilla. I am an alumnus of the university. I have to say, I also, for full disclosure, I serve on the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council for the Commonwealth. But my question, or actually comment, and one's related to the question, is the three questions you asked earlier. When we talk about the surveys that you displayed about people's belief on believing in climate change and or believing that human activity causes it. I think that the real issue, or the real fundamental basis of that, is not necessarily what's on the TV, but I think people don't want to believe it. I mean, I think the conversation with people should be on the realm of, I don't want to believe it either. This is a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue that's going to affect us. And I think fundamentally people, when someone says, well, there's one scientist that said this, they want to latch onto that. And I don't blame them. I think, we all want to do that, to say, well, everybody else is wrong and that person's right and it's not happening. And I think, so I'd like to have a comment on it. And also secondly, related to what I think the president needs to do in the State of the Union address, I think is somewhat related to that in addressing and saying, this is a difficult issue. And the one word we haven't heard from leaders in many, many years is sacrifice. Saying to the American people, this is a difficult issue, we all have to sacrifice, it's going to affect us, and asking that, they're all afraid to bring it to that term.
I really ought to turn this question to the specialists of the School of Public Affairs. Maybe they would comment as well. I think your first point that there's a natural resistance to wanting to have this be true, and psychologically wanting it not to be true. That makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know what we do about that, but I think that is part of it. And the fact that that's there then of course provides a really fertile field for people who want to enforce that view. I also think just if I might just spin a little bit on your point, I also think this is a very difficult issue to understand. That is, if you and I sat down and said, let's take an hour, let's think of a problem that people can't deal with, really uncertain. It may affect us or it may not. It's not really necessarily about us, it might be about your grandchildren. I mean, if we made this up, we'd have a hard time making up a tougher question for people to come to terms with that. So I have a lot of sympathy for the difficulty of understanding and really accepting. It's hard to do it. My line about this is sometimes when I'm on an airplane, and you're sitting on an airplane, and somebody says, what do you do? And you say, I work on climate change. And I've timed it. You have 52 seconds before they just zone out about it. Because you start explaining the complexity of it and people zone out. And if you're going to be honest about it, that's what it is. On the sacrifice, I believe that. I wish that we do that. Why is that not politically effective thing to do? And I only observe that it's not. I mean, maybe you can comment why they don't do that.
It's very hard to sell sacrifice, right? And especially, I mean, I wouldn't give the advice to Obama to sit in front of the fireplace wearing a sweater. We've sort of tried that once, right? And it didn't go very far. Jimmy Carter's attempt to call for energy efficiency and reductions in energy consumption. So we sort of do this with a yet larger goal in mind of stabilizing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I'm not sure this will fly. And so I suspect phrases, as much as I dislike them, like green growth or sustainable growth and prosperity in this context probably fly better than sacrifice. But at the end of the day, we need to be true to the issues. And will we sustain green growth in the long term? Growth, after all, means typically more materials and more energy to crank ever more stuff through the system and create more wastes along the way. What kind of society do we envision? One that we know right now that's based on fossil fuels and creates these problems, or an alternative? And I don't think we've had sort of that conversation about real alternatives of cutting the work week and providing other kinds of amenities to society that we value beyond sheer consumption of material goods and services. So once we have a clearer picture of what it means to sacrifice, it's actually not turning into a sacrifice, which is giving up one lifestyle for another which might be more desirable than the one we currently have. And painting that picture successfully, it's probably as complicated and difficult to do as explaining climate change within 52 seconds.
Just a bit of a comment. I think we talked about this earlier, that there's a little bit of a political shift post-Sandy, post the Mississippi River being unable to support transportation, or the fear of it almost happening. I hope what that means is not a focus on simply adaptation and how do we dredge our way or searoll our way out of this mess. But I think outside of the green growth framing, what we don't see enough is, rather than talk about sacrifice, a talk about choices. And I think often that the real choices that we could have, do we want to continue with fossil fuel dependence? Here's what's likely to happen. And to lay out scenarios, it takes more than 52 seconds, and maybe that is the problem. But I think at some point we have to assume some intelligence on the part of the electorate. And if faced with choices, a carbon tax versus continuing on the path we are, and lay those out, that we might at least get into a territory where people are debating real solutions to the problem.
Just another point on this, I think that another way that people push back against action in this area is to argue that it's the death of the economy, it's going to be a great sacrifice. So one of the problems is that a lot of the public information that's pushed out there, or pushed out on information pushed on the public, overstates what the level of sacrifice is. This is the point about the carbon tax. If you did it in a smart way, it's not necessarily that expensive. And you do always have winners and losers. And there's a problem with trying to compensate people who are losers. But to get started, to do something for the next few years and kind of work our way along and learn what it's going to cost and learn how the technology is going to behave, it's not really that costly. It's not that big a sacrifice. If you could convey the notion that we have to, I don't know, put some skin in the game, but somehow at the same time fight against the notion that this is going to be really terribly damaging to the economy, which in our analysis is not the case.
Well, I think a very good example of it is Deval Patrick's recent budget, and talking about the fact, not so much in sacrifice, but saying if we want to create the economy that we want down the line, we are going to have to tax ourselves more to pay for education, to pay for the infrastructure. And, you know, freed from another electoral campaign, he was able to lay it out and lay out a case, you know, contrast that to what Bobby Jindal laid out for Louisiana. So I'm hopeful that without having to worry about another election and having just appointed Kerry, that we'll see the same for Barack Obama in this State of the Union.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really great. My name is David Doyle. I run the workforce programs at the New England Clean Energy Council, an association of solar and wind and other companies. I had a question for you about the role of utility companies. Utility companies are regulated pretty heavily and don't necessarily require federal action. Is there a role for utility companies and their regulators to raise the status of climate change and how private utility, investor-owned utility companies are regulated?
I guess I expect utility companies and regulators to do what utility companies and regulators do. That is, utility companies are responsible to produce power and to keep the lights on and to take care of their shareholders. And the regulators, in general, their job is to keep the price down. So I think that the utilities have a really important role to play, but I think that role has to be imposed on them by legislation from somewhere else. That is, I don't want to demean a lot of utility executives who are quite constructive in this area. So I could name people in the national scene who are utility executives who've really been out front and done good stuff. I don't mean they're not there. But when it comes to really doing things that impose some substantial costs on their consumers, they have to come from somewhere else because that's not the world they live in. And the regulators, you need a regulation of this somewhere else, because if you're on the Public Utilities Commission, my understanding is your job of the Public Utilities Commission is to show that every investment is prudent. And I think greenhouse gas emissions is not normally in that legislation as to what they consider to be prudent. So I think it has to come from somewhere else. But I'd be interested in your view. Do you think otherwise?
I think we've seen that there are some states that have decided, with pressure from governors and legislators, to make it the business to start to incorporate climate change. But you're right. I mean, it doesn't trump those other interests. Those other interests are, first, keep the lights on, keep the prices low. That's what you're here for. Make sure there's no fraud, and make sure that people respond when there's a disaster by quick action. Climate change is down the list.
Let me give an example. I think in New England, in utilities, if they're making a calculation of whether to build plant A or plant B, then the legislation they're under requires them in some cases to put what they call utility adders. They have to kind of juggle the calculation under rules that say if this is going to produce this baddie, you have to put some number in there to reflect that baddie. So the number they used to come to the prudence discussion has that in it. But that didn't come from internally, that came from outside. But those are specific, that's a specific example of how it's done.
Yeah, there was gentleman.
Hi, my name is Richard Giordano. I've been a farmer's market manager for the last year, and been to a couple of the open classes now. I'd love to have you folks even re-emphasize what you said about the level of control of the dialogue and the message and who shapes opinion. And I'm so glad you mentioned the Heartland Institute. I used to work up at the State House as an aide years ago. And even then, every legislator, every representative, both at the State House and at City Hall, would get not only a free copy of the Heartland Institute, but about a dozen other magazines just like it, all with similar agendas, whether it was Cato Institute, Heritage, you name it, and they would come in every week. And I would throw them out every week. But the Koch brothers and the whole crew that they represent, 1%, have really honed the message and are controlling the debate. And they also are throwing a gazillion amount of dollars into political races, into foundations and the rest of that. So, A, we have to admit that that's who shaped the whole process, and they stand to lose tremendously. On our side of the issue, we need to somehow do something similar in the sense of controlling a clear message that gets out. I think we need something more like the civil rights movement or the anti-Vietnam War movement in terms of moving enough people. And then like jiu-jitsu, you have to sort of know when the time is that you can move and get something to happen. The transition town people are nice, they're good about a whole bunch of things. I don't see them making a movement, and I honestly think it's going to take a real movement to make substantial change the way you're talking about, to fight what the other guys have been able to do.
And there have been people, God bless them, who've tried to do that. I mean, Al Gore has certainly made a try. He's, I think, an imperfect vessel for this for a number of reasons, but he certainly put his body into this and tried. Bill McKibben, the guy who's tried very hard to do this, is not quite caught. I think it needs someone of a somewhat different cast to draw, and I thought that really needs to come more from the top of the political system, but we have ideas about how to make that happen. We're not in that business in what we do, but certainly getting that kind of a movement that had leadership that attracted people's attention. If there's a way to make that happen, it would certainly be useful, because you are working against very large interests. So we're talking about the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce and major industrial interests who don't necessarily represent all the people, all their constituencies, but they have a strong influence on this issue.
There's a question here to the right. Thanks.
Jay Rolander, General Internist at the VA here in Lincoln, Boston. I have a question about the science and another question about the message of the 1%. Our first speaker of this series, James Henderson, he suggested that with just an additional small change in the temperature and an increase in the CO2 emissions, the permafrost will melt and release even more gases, and that shape of the rate of change of the greenhouse gases will accelerate. And that didn't seem to be included in your graph. I wonder if you agree with that science, because he painted a very disturbing picture as the ice up north melts and the sea rises will certainly have an economic disaster on both coasts. And then the second question is the message for another commentary, because on a regular basis we see in the paper that fracking's created cheap natural gas, and the continued oil exploration has found new sources to last many decades. And so it looks like not additional natural gas, we may be self-sufficient in oil production in this country. And that's a huge economic engine. How do you fight against that when there's cheap fuel and it's an extension of the same? I think that's a message
just to explain that there's, if the permafrost melts, it produces lakes. And in the lakes, you have methanogenic bacteria that produce methane. So the thing is that you might get an outgassing of methane from that. And there's methane also caught in, bound up in ice molecules and stuff. So there's possibly of methane coming out. Then the tundra has got a lot of carbon, like 80 years of our emissions or something stored in the carbon. So if it dries out, then the bugs will eat it and and release the CO2. So that's the thing you're talking about. My understanding of this is that the methane issue, at least by we have people work on this, and they think that the methane issue, although it's there, it's potentially significant, but it's not large in relation to our emissions of methane, at least on a century scale. On a longer time scale, like where you would get substantial drying of the tundra and the CO2 begins to come out of the tundra. That is a very long-term process, but that is another kicker into the system. Yes, but the notion that there are these various things in the system, sort of trigger points or tipping points or something like that are kind of for those of you who are in the statistical business, fat tail events, things that are way out that might happen. I would say our folks think the methane issue on a century scale is not that big a problem, but on a longer time scale, the fact that the tundra would dry out, and if the tundra dries out, then the bacteria eat the tundra, eat the carbon, and release CO2, and that would be a longer term problem. It's not so. As an economist, I've exhausted my scientific knowledge about it. On the methane, I mean, our story about methane is that it is a good news, bad news story. Because the methane is a big help in the short run, because it's displacing coal. It's better than coal. In terms of greenhouse gas effects, it's better than coal. So that's good. But it's not a long-term solution, because the methane is also emitting CO2. So if we're going to have a substantial cut, then methane really has a big help on the climate issue for 20, 30 years. But longer term, it's not the long-term solution. So it's the notion that we're going to become independent of oil imports, that the gas and the oil is going to make us independent of oil imports. I know people say that. I wonder. I think certainly our oil imports are going to go down. Whether it'll ever be zero, I sort of doubt that, but certainly it's making a big difference. The fracking of the oil is making a huge difference. This is the point to remember with all the noise about fracking in the paper is all about gas, but that's not the only thing. This technology is heavily used in North Dakota. The oil.
We have time for 2 more questions, and there are 2 more hands up, so this is perfect.
Hi, my name is Stefan. I'm an undergraduate student here, and my question is with a corporate tax rate of 35%, which a lot of American corporations find very high, do you believe that they could be enticed to accept maybe a value-added carbon tax among large commercial users if it was offset by a reduction in the corporate rate? And so that I guess that way companies that were more efficient in their carbon or in their energy usage would be rewarded with lower tax rates? Or do you believe that any sort of carbon tax you would have people or the corporations kicking and screaming to hold on to the status quo?
Well, our work would show that for industry as a whole, if the industry as a whole would benefit if you could substitute carbon tax for some percentage of the corporate income tax. That would be a good thing. But one of the difficulties is we're back to this small group problem. Is that there are going to be some people who don't win, and they're going to be noisy, and that's going to be a problem. But yes, that would be a positive thing. That would be economically a positive thing to do. Yeah. And would not generally be supported. Just if that was the only issue. I mean, let's take the other question now.
My name's Matt Terrace. I'm a mechanical engineering undergrad here. My question is towards energy, specifically energy storage. We keep hearing a lot about like what we're doing right now. We're doing the coal to gas switchings or having renewables in, but people don't want renewables because they're like too intermittent. You can't predict it all. But I haven't been really hearing too much about energy storage. I know there's a lot of bad press with the whole A123 going under and the government being behind it. But I was speaking to some other Northeastern professor who's doing a lot of like chemical research with batteries, and it sounds like there's more promising things on the near horizon. And I was just wondering if the talks are going on, at least with you or people like high up in this issue, and if you guys are even considering this for the future and how it would change the landscape of energy use.
There are a lot of, there's storages at different levels. I mean, there's storage to deal with the fluctuations at very short periods of time, like seconds and minutes or hours. So there's some of those things, the A123 batteries, some of those batteries, those are the kind of batteries that gave Boeing a problem. And they're beginning to be used. But the dealing with wind and solar, you need to have batteries that, particularly with wind, you need to have batteries that can store enough power to displace the wind with the wind doesn't blow for many hours or days. So you need really, really large scale storage. That is actively being researched, but there is a professor at MIT who has an idea of a liquid metal battery, and I'm not a chemist to go through this here. But it would be a large scale installation. It might be an installation the size of this room, a big battery the size of this room, where you're moving ions back and forth between two metals, and might be able to be worked at very large scale. But this is at the forefront of research. We don't really know. And so our analysis of this would say that you're going to stabilize, you're going to provide a correction for the intermittency, particularly of wind, with natural gas. And the natural gas plants are the natural gas turbine plants are not very expensive, and they wouldn't run a lot, so they're not going to generate a lot of emissions. And that's largely the way that would be done. There are other research goes on, I mean, with compressed air systems, and maybe other places that do pump water storage and stuff. But I don't see anything on the horizon now that's going to give long-term storage. But I think wind's getting pretty close to being competitive, and we add and that even includes the cost of the backup power to provide for the intermittency. And solar's a different matter because people consume a lot of power when the sun's up. So it's another kind of less of a challenge for solar than it is for wind. But certainly, if you want to go on the web and look up liquid metal battery, and you'll find this large scale new idea that people are pushing. He talks a good game, whether it's real or not. I'm not just the judge.
Join me in thanking our speaker. Some of you may be familiar with the term coined by Amory Lovins called a negawatt, and it is a unit of energy not used. And he argues that one of the biggest things we have to do as part of the climate solution is to use less. So next week we'll be talking about energy efficiency. We have two speakers, Dick Henry from the Jordan Institute and our own Doug Foy, who's been part of the panel, but we haven't really heard from him. And so many of you know the great work Doug has done in Massachusetts on energy efficiency and many other environmental issues, but you probably don't know the work that he's been doing, going around the country, working with other cities and states on energy efficiency. So he's going to talk to us next week about that work along with Dick Henry. So we hope to see you back next week. Thank you.